Lost in the grief and the emotion that continues 50 years after the assassination of John F. Kennedy lies what may be the most tragic element of his passing, what might have been. From civil rights to Vietnam to the murders of both MLK and Jack's brother Bobby in the most tumultuous year of the 20th century, all the way to the election of Richard Nixon and Watergate. Dallas, one could argue, changed our nation's timeline and did so for the worse. For more, I'm very pleased to be joined now by Professor Yanek Mieczkowski. He's chair of the History Department at Dowling College on Long Island. Professor, thank you as always. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
The questions of what if. Historians, they have, juggled this answer, and there's no simple, straightforward answer. But to put in context what it was like, not just in the immediate aftermath, but in the trinity of deaths with Dr. King and Bobby, it can't be overstated how much unsurety, if that's a word, there was in this country in that window of time.
Yeah, it certainly, Kennedy's death marked a moment where America was right on the cusp of being a proud and prosperous nation with a lot of confidence, and I think this is one reason why Americans look back so nostalgically on John F. Kennedy. He, as Scotty Reston of the New York Times said, he never reached his meridian. He was always a rising sun for us, and I guess the same could be said of Eisenhower, but Kennedy captured it in a way that was very charismatic and with mystique and with a lot of fanfare, and it did strike down the nation's confidence to see a leader cut down in his prime when everything seemed to be going well for this country. And then after that, in the 1960s, the country descended into protests over the Vietnam War, domestic unrest.
Let's start there, if we could, in Vietnam. What does history tell us what Kennedy might have done differently than certainly what followed with Vietnam?
Well, Kennedy admirers, of course, say that he would have avoided that, and then most historians think that he probably would have followed a similar path to what Lyndon Johnson did. Looking at the evidence, some of Robert McNamara and Kenny O'Donnell said that Kennedy did tell them that he wanted to withdraw troops from Vietnam, and in some interviews, Kennedy did say, "It is their war." But I think Kennedy, some of the evidence shows that Kennedy would have followed a similar path to Vietnam. I mean, the number of troops increased from 900 when Eisenhower left office to almost more than 16,000. Kennedy also saw Vietnam as a test case for containment. He did believe in the domino theory and stopping Soviet advances. He did look at the Third World as a real battleground for stopping Soviet Union advances. And he did say to one aide that if we let the Soviet Union and communist forces take more territory, we're going to have Joe McCarthy, a Red Scare. So in other words, he feared the political repercussions. And he did himself, as a congressman, criticize Truman for losing China in 1949.
Civil rights, it's a complicated bag, because certainly few debate that within the Kennedy family, Bobby was the more passionate one. And the more cautious one on the subject was John. To that degree, and we'll hear later some very powerful words in some of the addresses that JFK did on the subject, but history can let us have a pretty good idea that he didn't want to push it too fast, maybe not even as fast as some of his closest advisors wanted.
He was afraid of the Southern Democrats in Congress. They were very powerful, and he was very leery of dealing with them. They exerted a lot of pressure and could have capsized his New Frontier legislative program. In fact, he never really got any major piece of legislation of that New Frontier program passed. But one of the things about Kennedy was his capacity to grow in office and improve himself. And whereas he didn't show real sensitivity to the moral issues and the suffering of African Americans, he was more concerned about the image, how civil rights and segregation detracted from America's image on the world stage. He did, by the end of his time in office, show increasing sensitivity to that in that famous June 1963 speech where he proposed legislation to begin desegregation. That marked a real change in his administration and a real promise for him.
I remember, speaking of anniversaries, the March on Washington, and the president himself wasn't sure how that was going to turn out. And a lot of people, not just within the administration, but even in law enforcement, thought it was going to degenerate into riots. But once he saw how it played out, he brought Dr. King and other of the lead organizers up to the Oval Office for a conversation. And in many ways, that's an encapsulated example of how he was on that issue, not sure, but then when he sees the way it's going, he doesn't need advisors to tell him that this is different than we thought in the morning. By evening, even on that subject, there was a little bit more clarity as to where the country was.
Yeah, the administration was very concerned about how that March on Washington would play out, and Robert Kennedy tried to control some of the events, even some of the remarks of some of the speakers like John Lewis, to get them to tone it down. So much so that Malcolm X criticized the March on Washington as the farce on Washington, he called it. But Kennedy was very impressed with Dr. Martin Luther King's speech and invited him to the White House later, and as he was watching it, he said, "This guy is really good." So again, it showed his capacity to grow in office and be more sensitive.
Why is John F. Kennedy in many ways still so alive today for so many Americans?
Part of it is the mystery surrounding his assassination, even though the Warren Commission and other investigations, I mean, this week there have been investigations aired on TV, or this past week by Nova and other very reputable news agencies that support the lone gunman theory. There will always be a large percentage, usually polls show a majority, 60%, 70% of Americans feel that there was some kind of conspiracy. So it's partly the mystery surrounding his death, it's partly the mystique and fascination with an American royalty. The Kennedys in some ways are the closest thing Americans have had with the royal family. Kennedy is the only modern president who has so many unanswerable questions. We don't know what he would have done. We don't know what course he would have taken down this country down. He served before tragedies like Vietnam, before scandals like Watergate, and later Iran-Contra and Monica Lewinsky. So he served at a very good moment for Americans, where they still trusted presidents and what they said, and still embodied the ideals that Americans believed in.
Well, it's amazing as we're seeing the scenes playing out here, just how invested America is in many ways, an unfinished not only life but story. But Professor Mieczkowski, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot for having me, Rich.
All right, everyone. When we come back, we'll continue our coverage, and you'll hear from President Kennedy in his own words.